We're very excited to be talking about this new piece of work today on boosting voluntary climate action in New Zealand. Again, I'm a policy fellow at Motu, and while I also have a role as one of New Zealand's climate change commissioners, I am not presenting in my climate change commissioner capacity today. I'm only speaking as a Motu fellow. And of course, I'd like to begin by acknowledging ICA for commissioning this work and invite Kate and Jeremy to say a few words before I dive into the formal presentation.
Tēnā koutou everyone, thank you for joining us today. ICA is really proud to have commissioned this research into boosting voluntary climate mitigation in Aotearoa. Really wanted to start a conversation on innovative ways to address climate change, and it's well aligned with our purpose to mobilise New Zealanders to be world leaders in clean and clever energy use. Thank you for joining us today. I'll hand over to Jeremy.
Hello, thank you. So I want to say a few words about the why ICA is involved in this work. At ICA, we are witnessing every day missed opportunity with mitigation projects that could be done right now and achieve emission reduction, but they are not implemented because of capital constraint, capital competition, or just a lack of prioritization in the organization that have these opportunities. And on the other side of the spectrum, there are organizations that want to demonstrate good climate behavior to their customer or their shareholders, but they don't have much practical opportunity in their own premises. So in our view, obviously, the voluntary carbon market could be there to join the dot between these projects and these organizations that are willing to demonstrate good climate behavior. And it was not possible to date in New Zealand for reasons Catherine will explain during her presentation. But moving into the Paris Agreement might be the opportunity to open domestic mitigation beyond forestry in New Zealand. Beyond that, traditional offsetting is not scalable and has a history of shortcomings internationally, which created trust issues. And we think again that moving into the Paris Agreement is an opportunity to improve voluntary mitigation and scale it to a size that is meaningful and increase the pace of New Zealand transition. Thank you.
Thanks very
Catherine.
much, Jeremy. I'll go ahead and start my presentation. I'll be giving a formal presentation that probably takes about 50 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Great. So again, the presentation is on our new report, Boosting Voluntary Climate Action in Aotearoa New Zealand. And I'll just start with some acknowledgements. As you've mentioned, this was commissioned by the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority. This paper has been co-authored by myself and my Motu colleague, Dominic White. Our work was informed by a cross-sector dialogue, which Motu ran in the latter part of 2020. This consisted of participants in their personal capacity, but they're experts from a range of organizations in New Zealand. And importantly, the paper does not represent the views of ICA or the New Zealand government, dialogue participants, or the New Zealand Climate Change Commission, and no endorsement is implied. So I'll start with some key messages in case you need to come off the call early. The first is that Aotearoa faces a gap to meet its Paris target, and then the world faces a collective gap beyond the Paris targets that have been committed to prevent dangerous climate change. So we have an emissions gap, a time gap, and a finance gap. And there is potential for voluntary action by organizations to help us bridge these gaps. And organizations are increasingly motivated and being pressured externally to do extra to help. But the past framework that we've used, which evolved under the Kyoto Protocol era, actually is not going to function effectively under the Paris Agreement and domestic policies. So in this paper, we're proposing ambitious targets for organizations' own emissions and 2 tracks for recognizing external voluntary mitigation or offsetting that helps Aotearoa either meet its Paris target or mitigate beyond the Paris target. This proposal would incentivize voluntary climate action and better enable credible, transparent, and marketable claims by organizations, with or without corresponding adjustments by the government under our Paris target. And I'll be detailing what I mean by a corresponding adjustment. This framework could accommodate the Carbon Neutral Government Program, which was announced in December 2020 and is still under development. And finally, further market testing and policy development will be needed to advance this concept. What we are putting forward here is an overarching framework, and it would need support from the public and private sectors to get this over the line. So today I'll be covering what is voluntary mitigation in the scope of our paper, why crediting voluntary mitigation needs to change, the evolving international context, a proposal for a two-track solution, practical examples for how this could work, and then what it would actually take to make this happen. So what do I mean by voluntary mitigation? Well, I'll start with compliance mitigation. So compliance mitigation consists of actions to reduce or remove greenhouse gases as required by government. Usually this happens through either regulations or, in our case, an emissions trading scheme. And in both cases, the liabilities apply to specific parties within a supply chain. Compliance carbon markets are controlled under legislation, and the unit supply and prices align with government targets. In contrast, we have voluntary mitigation, which consists of actions to reduce or remove greenhouse gases beyond government requirements. Participation is entirely voluntary and can happen anywhere within supply chains and at multiple points within supply chains at the same time. Voluntary carbon markets are driven by participant supply and demand, and they're guided by market standards which have evolved over time rather than laws. They are still subject to fair trade requirements. So the world is on a global transition toward carbon neutrality. And in the Paris Agreement, this is characterized as achieving a balance between emissions from sources and removals from sinks later in the century. In the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's guidance, we see that we're looking toward a transition to net zero emissions of carbon dioxide and significant reductions in non-CO2 greenhouse gases. So in this context, the global transition to carbon neutrality is a long-term process. But alongside this a concept of organizational carbon neutrality has evolved. And this approach consists of an organization measuring its own emissions within a clearly defined scope and boundary and time frame, reducing its own emissions as far as possible, and then offsetting residual emissions through external financing of mitigation activity. Measure, reduce, and offset. And this enables an organization to claim carbon neutrality over a specific period of time starting now. Now, in order to qualify as offsetting, the offset mitigation must be transparent, real, measurable, and verified, additional what would happen otherwise, not double counted, address leakage, and be permanent. Now, this list of characteristics I'm citing from a report from the Ministry for the Environment on voluntary offsetting, but this is a pretty internationally developed and tested list, and these are widely accepted criteria for offset. The general concept is that an offset should have as much integrity as if an organization was reducing emissions itself. Now, voluntary mitigation can take many forms, and sometimes people just jump straight to voluntary offsetting, but that's actually one of a whole range of options. So the first and most obvious place to start is reducing one's own emissions. But also we could look at partnering in or otherwise supporting voluntary mitigation projects, marketing low emission goods and services, and then of course buying and canceling offset units through the voluntary carbon market. And the paper explains briefly how the voluntary carbon market works. This graphic is a high level representation. So here we have a mitigation provider who has a mitigation opportunity, but doesn't have the financing and conditions that are necessary to get that project over the line. And then we have a mitigation funder who's looking to shrink its own emission footprint. So the mitigation funder provides carbon finance to the mitigation provider to make the project viable, and in return gets voluntary carbon credits, which I've labeled here as VCCs, and those can be canceled and used to offset or reduce a portion of that mitigation funder's footprint. And the system does have oversight. There's a market certifier who ensures that the offset units have environmental integrity before they're sold. There's a footprint certifier who's looking at the mitigation funder's footprint and can verify that these units have been purchased and canceled. And then there's a market regulator that's just looking at fair trade and so on. So the system does have oversight. Now, voluntary mitigation can deliver really important benefits. And to me, this is what we always need to be keeping in mind as we're thinking about new frameworks, is how can we achieve the maximum benefits here? So a key one for organizations is demonstrating environmental and social responsibility and leadership. A second one is increasing market advantage, particularly among consumers with growing levels of awareness about these issues. For Aotearoa more broadly, the benefits include boosting innovation and investment, helping to redistribute mitigation costs for a more just transition, and educating people and shifting social norms. So these are the benefit drivers that have been around the whole time we've been doing voluntary mitigation. But we're now also seeing growing risk drivers for voluntary mitigation. We're expecting these to increase over time as well. For example, we're now seeing climate risk disclosure requirements for financing, investment, and insurance. We're seeing greater calls for voluntary action as maintaining social license to operate. And we're also seeing other entities within supply chains putting supply chain requirements on upstream and downstream supply chain participants. We're seeing growing calls for eco-labeling. And of course, supply chains are subject to increasingly ambitious emissions trading prices and regulations. So they've got more of an incentive to help decarbonize their supply chains. And then there's the issue of growing consumer preferences. So the next section looks at why crediting voluntary mitigation needs to change. It's a bit ironic that just at this time that momentum is growing, the underlying framework is shifting. So there are three key change drivers I'm going to focus on today. The first is the limitations of current offsetting, which Jeremy referred to in his introduction. The second is looking at the different architecture of the Paris Agreement compared to the previous Kyoto era. And the third is the substantial accounting challenges around domestic voluntary mitigation, particularly for us here in Aotearoa. And there are three I'm going to focus on here. One is double counting by organizations and governments. The second is waterbed or displacement effects within the domestic system. And the third is overlapping organizational greenhouse gas footprints. So we move into a new era of offsetting with a lot of baggage around the history of offsetting. And I do want to emphasize here that in some cases, offsetting actually has worked effectively in the past. And I don't mean to say that all offsetting has not worked, because actually some of it has been good. But we have had some big issues that have come up, and this is an opportunity if we're rethinking frameworks to think, how could we do this even better? So one of the challenges has been inconsistent accounting boundaries. And this is particularly around how far organizations go in accounting for indirect emissions downstream. Think about an organization like BP, which is trying to make a carbon neutral claim when it's selling petroleum products, for example. Organizations have been very inconsistent about how far they go in reporting and offsetting against scope 3 emissions or indirect emissions, and I'll explain the scopes a little bit further on. A second problem with offsetting is that it can be used to obscure organizations' own emissions. So in the past, when it was possible to purchase low cost, low quality Kyoto offset units, an organization could actually do very little to reduce its own footprint and then could use offsets and claim carbon neutrality at relatively low cost. So there was concern that actually organizations weren't doing enough effort themselves to make a difference. Another issue is that it's possible for forestry removals to displace progress on more expensive and more complex reductions in gross emissions, which are going to be absolutely essential for long-term decarbonization and preventing dangerous climate change. Forestry has a really important and useful role to play, but it shouldn't displace progress in other sectors. When people have been focusing on carbon offsetting, they've sometimes overlooked the co-impacts, both positive and negative. So mitigation can have impacts on air and water quality, biodiversity, community cohesion, community rights. So there can be broader levels of impact, and those don't get described well if you're just thinking about trading carbon. Now, again, there are clear exceptions to this. A lot of organizations are very transparent about the co-impacts of their mitigation, which is great. But I think there's even more we could do in this space. Sometimes we've seen that organizations have a limited incentive to think beyond their own emission footprint and go what you could call either carbon negative or climate positive, depending on how you want to think about it. But sometimes organizations may only feel incentivized to mitigate up to the level of their own emissions footprint and not think about how they could contribute to system transformation. And then finally, voluntary offsetting has been a bit of a niche activity. And if we are actually evolving into a world where most organizations have targets and are expected to be transitioning toward net zero, then we're going to find ourselves in a situation where the demand for offset units far exceeds supply at large scale. So then there's this issue of the architecture in the Paris Agreement, and this is going to force some fundamental changes to how we think about voluntary offsetting. So under the Kyoto model, which operated from 2008 till 2020, we had unit-based targets for industrialized countries and projects for industrialized countries and for developing countries. And if an industrialized country wanted to do a project, it had to cancel its unit-based targets. But basically, the Kyoto Protocol was designed as a giant cap and trade scheme, and everything was delineated in units, whether we were talking about targets or projects. And it was possible for both governments and organizations to trade units and to cancel units. And when units were voluntarily canceled, that automatically boosted the climate ambition of the Kyoto system. Using this unit-based system, it was possible for the voluntary market to more easily avoid double counting. But one of the key challenges here is that the integrity of the system really depended on the additionality of the projects that were creating additional offset units. And of course, as we saw with the clean development mechanism, that had some problems. And we found that in joint implementation as well for some industrialized countries. The Paris model is very different. We now have targets that are defined for both industrialized and developing countries, and they are inventory-based targets. These targets take very diverse forms. Some of them are absolute economy-wide targets, but other ones operate on an intensity basis. And some of them only apply to sectors or involve implementing specific policies. And for example, part of China's NDC or its Paris target is a CO2 peak year. So we are now moving away from a unit-based system where everything is covered. It is still possible for countries to cooperate to meet their targets, but this happens now through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and this involves something called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. This enables mitigation to be transferred between countries, but it is not supposed to be double counted by countries. Right now, given the slow progress in developing the rules for Article 6, we're expecting that international emissions trading will be limited to governments for now. There currently is no mechanism that would allow a non-government organization in Aotearoa to directly buy Paris compliant mitigation offshore. This might become possible over time, but it will probably take a considerable amount of time to get there. And similarly, there is no way outside of government for other organizations to boost target ambition the way they could do in the Kyoto framework by voluntarily canceling units. So this means the voluntary market needs to rethink both double counting and additionality. I'll just briefly explain how NDC accounting works. So again, this nationally determined contribution is our Paris target. And the rules for this are still under development, but this is generally how we'll expect the process to work. So here we have country X and then Aotearoa New Zealand. Both of them have NDCs, or targets, which are listed in the blue box. Now for country X, it's found that it's actually able to mitigate very successfully and actually generate some surplus mitigation. Whereas Aotearoa New Zealand has a gap to meet its target, so we have a shortfall that we need to bridge. So in this case, country X can actually trade its surplus mitigation to New Zealand in the form of an ITMO, and New Zealand provides carbon finance back to the country X. Now to avoid double counting, there's an adjustment that needs to happen. So within the host country's inventory, you'll see here I've labeled CA, that stands for corresponding adjustment. And basically when country X sells its surplus mitigation to New Zealand, it needs to make a corresponding adjustment, which essentially adds those emissions back into the inventory. So when both countries report against their NDCs to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, both of them will report that they exactly met their NDCs. For country X, it will be through net emissions plus the corresponding adjustment. And for New Zealand, it will be net emissions plus the ITMO. Now, if New Zealand wanted to make some of its NDC available to organizations for carbon neutral offsetting, then we would kind of see a reversal of positions. New Zealand would be like country X and would be basically providing a corresponding adjustment in its inventory in return for making some level of mitigation available to organizations to cancel. And the New Zealand government has not yet made a decision about whether it's willing to make corresponding adjustments and provide offsets to domestic organizations. So this leads me to the series of accounting challenges. The first is double counting by government. So again, one of the key principles of offsetting in the past is that offsets cannot be double counted under a target or by any other organization if they're used for a carbon neutral claim. In this new inventory-based world, project-based reductions will automatically be reflected in New Zealand's greenhouse gas inventory and counted by the government toward its Paris target, unless they fall outside of the target accounting or the government agrees to make a corresponding adjustment. Now, there are some exclusions currently from our Paris target, but they're relatively small. That's small-scale tree planting, which could be significant, but again, doesn't have the scale necessarily to deliver demand over time. Well, we could also look at soil carbon management, wetlands management, and blue carbon. The second accounting challenge is waterbed effects. We are relatively unique in that we have a broad-based emissions trading scheme, which is embedded within economy-wide emissions budgets, which are embedded within our Paris targets. So we have this series of bubbles, and when you push on one part of the bubble, it's like squeezing a balloon or sitting on a waterbed and sending those emissions somewhere else in the system. So I've tried to illustrate that in this series of diagrams. And so if someone undertakes a voluntary mitigation project within an ETS sector, basically that frees up space in the cap for someone else to emit more that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Now, the government could prevent those displaced emissions by ratcheting down the ETS cap, but then there's the possibility that that extra space or opportunity to emit more could actually just flow upstream through remaining emissions budget. So people could emit more in non-ETS sectors. And to prevent those displaced emissions, the government could ratchet down emissions budgets, but then there's a further flow upstream in that New Zealand could still meet the same NDC and have the same global climate contribution, but just purchase less offshore mitigation. So this makes it possible for someone to undertake a fantastic voluntary mitigation effort within the ETS, but have it make no impact whatsoever on global emission outcomes. Now, when I've laid this out in the paper and in the presentation, it's a very kind of simplistic and absolute way of looking at it. There are some additional complications that I just want to flag, but I won't go into detail today, that could distort the timing around this around how this happens. You know, for example, we've got banking of units, we've got cap adjustments, we've got the auction reserve price. So there could be additional mechanisms that actually do make it possible for voluntary mitigation to contribute. You know, for example, if the government were to keep increasing the ETS cap or were to fail to meet its NDC through offshore purchasing, then voluntary mitigation could become even more valuable. This often raises questions about, well, how does the voluntary carbon market interact with the ETS? And there are some fundamental misconceptions that are prevalent in the market and that do need to be cleared up. The first is that complying with the ETS, like by surrendering NZUs and then paying the ETS price that gets passed through in supply chains and goods and services, these practices do not neutralize emissions. This is basically the cost of bringing emissions down to the level of the cap. Also, voluntarily canceling NZUs does not generate a further climate benefit. This could be for two reasons. The first is that we've got some automatic supply feedbacks. We have annual cap adjustments, and then we also have a cost containment reserve. So for example, if someone was to go and cancel a large number of NZUs, it would drive up emission prices. That could trigger the cost containment reserve, and then the government basically adds more unit supply to the market to compensate. The second problem, again, is because of this waterbed effect, that voluntarily canceling NZUs actually will not affect our NDC unless the government makes a subsequent adjustment. And this has not been enabled to date. Now, this was different in the past. And in our case, most domestic voluntary offsetting happened through the Permanent Forest Sink Initiative. This was started back in 2006. And this issued units which were eligible either in the ETS or for voluntary offsetting. It was up to the choice of the landowner wherever they sold the unit. In this case, voluntarily canceling a PFSI unit, whether that was a New Zealand assigned amount unit, which was first issued, or later an NZU, this made it harder for Aotearoa to meet its international target under first the Kyoto Protocol and then under the UNFCCC. And this automatically prevented double counting by the government under its target. But now the PFSI is merging into the emissions trading scheme, and the mechanism that prevented double counting, which was called the voluntary cancellation workflow, is sunsetting. Technically, it should have ended in 2020, but we're in a true-up period from the Kyoto Protocol, which is why it's still operating now. So currently, when firms are offsetting using PFSI units, they're using units that have been generated in the past, and they're being subtracted off of our 2020 target using the voluntary cancellation workflow. The third accounting challenge is organizational footprint boundaries. So the convention is that at an organizational level, you look at three scopes. Scope 1 is direct emissions. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions from electricity, heat, and steam. And Scope 3 is other indirect emissions. And this means that organizations are accounting for both production and consumption emissions at the same time and are looking at upstream and downstream sources in their supply chain. This means that organizations and governments account for GHG footprints very differently. Governments only work on a production basis. They do track some consumption emissions now, but it's for our inventory reporting under Paris, it's all production based. And this also means that organizational footprints double count supply chain emissions by design. So we have an offsetting system that's evolved to say no double counting, but then we've got this fundamental definition of organizational boundaries that involves double counting. And this has led to some contradictory outcomes. So for example, an emitting organization that owns a forest can achieve carbon neutrality with double counting of all the emissions and removals by the government. But if it tries to do the same thing using external forestry offsets, those offsets cannot be double counted by the government. So again, this seems like a double standard. Also, an organization that reduces emissions within its supply chain can achieve carbon neutrality with double counting across the supply chain. But if it buys external offsets, the reductions cannot be double counted by other entities. So here's a little case study that brings it all together and just highlights why it's challenging to do this in New Zealand. So Company X provides funding to Greenhouse Y to replace a coal boiler with a biomass boiler fueled by farm waste. Greenhouse Y generates emissions reductions that are independently verified, and Company X claims offsets against its own operational emissions. Now, this is a fantastic project. We want this sort of thing to happen. It's preparing Greenhouse Y for a low emission future. It has spillover learning benefits and helps to shift social norms. And then Company X is helping all of this to happen. From an accounting perspective, we'd want to make sure that the additionality assessment accounts for the emission price incentive created by our ETS and also other government incentives and policies, for example, looking at boiler fuel switching. In this case, Greenhouse Y would be reporting emission reductions and Company X would be reporting offsets. Both would reduce their footprints, and other entities across both supply chains would likewise report reduced footprints. The government would report lower boiler emissions in its national greenhouse gas inventory. However, those emission benefits will be displaced in the ETS unless the cap is adjusted downward. The emission benefits will be displaced in non-ETS sectors unless the emissions budget is adjusted downward. And the emissions benefits will be displaced by less offshore purchasing unless the NDC is adjusted downward or the inventory is adjusted. So we are not the only country facing this challenge, although the fact we have our broad-based ETS emissions budgets adds an extra level of complexity. But this fundamental question about how to do voluntary offsetting under the Paris Agreement is actually challenging everybody right now. And there are lots of views about the future. And so here's the key question. Can carbon neutral offset claims be made by organizations and double counted by governments toward their target? And I've just done a quick survey to look at who says what. And here are some examples. So if we look at the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, ICROA, they serve as the umbrella organization for safeguarding integrity across the top performers in the voluntary carbon market. Their position is that organizational accounting and government accounting can operate on separate planes. And it's fine for an organization's voluntary project to be used for a carbon neutral claim and counted toward an NDC as long as only one government reports that mitigation to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So as far as they're concerned, double counting between an organization and one government is fine. However, Gold Standard, which is a member of ICROA, has come out and said no. If you want to make a carbon neutral claim, it cannot count toward a target. However, they've suggested there could be an alternative of a carbon financing claim, which does count toward the Paris target. We're also getting a no from the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute and Stockholm Environment Institute. And then there's several organizations that either don't have a position or haven't quite decided yet. So this is Vera, which is also one of the leading certification organizations. And they've said, we just want to label the product very clearly so customers can choose and know what they're getting, whether or not it has a corresponding adjustment. There's a very high profile task force on scaling voluntary mitigation. This is being championed by Mark Carney and some very prestigious international organizations. And they have specifically not taken a position on this issue. They're waiting on the Paris Agreement Article 6 negotiations on international trading. There's a group of sort of environmental NGOs and think tanks which are working together, and they're still thinking about it. And then there's the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has a new net zero target option, and ISO is developing a carbon neutral standard, and those are under early development. I don't have specific guidance on exactly how they're going to fall on this issue. And then we've got two organizations that are actually saying the old offsetting model should just go, and we should actually just look at a new form of carbon contribution or carbon financing claim. And the Net Zero Initiative, which is a group that's come out in France, has championed this idea, and also a recent report on a corporate blueprint by World Wildlife Fund for Nature and the Boston Consulting Group. Very clear, it's like, let's move beyond offsetting. We need to think about carbon financing and contributions, and those do count toward government targets. So basically, the jury is out, and this creates a lot of uncertainty for organizations that are trying to make marketing claims in both domestic and international markets. Okay, so all of this gives the background for why we need a new approach, and I'll lay out what we're suggesting in our paper. I am making some key assumptions here, and I think that the proposal is still resilient, even if these key assumptions don't apply, but we would need to think them through. So the first is I am assuming that New Zealand will meet its nationally determined contribution and will be able to bridge any gap with offshore mitigation. I'm assuming that non-government actors will not be able to directly buy or sell Paris compliant mitigation for the foreseeable future, and the ETS cap will be binding on net emissions. Now, there are four possible tracks that we could choose from. There's a set of tracks with no double counting under government targets, and there's a set of tracks with double counting. So under the no double counting track, the best option would be offsetting with a government corresponding adjustment, as I explained. But it's possible that there might be some developing countries, particularly least developed countries, that just don't have the administrative capacity to issue corresponding adjustments. So maybe there would be some transitional period where there would be alternative certification that gets accepted in place of the corresponding adjustment. In the double counting, we could think of two options. One is some form of offsetting within the NDC, and the second would be an alternative form of carbon contribution. And we're basically proposing a two-track approach for offsetting that would enable organizations with different sets of interests and needs to participate. So the common element for the whole framework is starting with voluntary targets for organizations' own emissions. And we're proposing that that should cover scopes 1, 2, and 3 with as much as 3 as practicable, but recognizing we need to be realistic about what is practical. And these should be in line with the achieving the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. For organizations that want to go beyond their own emissions to try to compensate for residual emissions, then there are two tracks that they could choose between. The Carbon Horizon track would help to bridge the gap to meet Paris NDCs. This would provide certification or carbon credits for external mitigation beyond government requirements. And this focuses on shared claims to mitigation. Track 2 is called Carbon Frontier, and this supports global mitigation beyond Paris NDCs. This provides carbon credits with corresponding adjustments for external mitigation beyond government requirements. And this focuses on single claims to mitigation. So it's important to think about what claims organizations might make here. And again, this is a high-level framework and would still need further development and testing. So what we're suggesting is that under Carbon Horizon, so again, this is to help bridge the gap to meet a target, an organization could make a carbon neutral or carbon positive claim to the NDC if it fully offset its residual emissions within the target system. Alternatively, an organization could claim a carbon contribution to the NDC. So this would be financing some other level of mitigation, perhaps that doesn't fully offset residual emissions. The claims could involve offsets or certification, but everything would be reported transparently in a registry and no government corresponding adjustments would be required. In contrast, under Carbon Frontier, an organization could claim carbon neutral or carbon positive contribution to global emissions. The claims would involve offsets via a registry, and the offsets must have corresponding adjustments. So the distinction here is that carbon neutral horizon would be carbon neutral in the context of meeting an NDC, whereas carbon neutral frontier would involve a carbon neutral contribution to global emissions. Now, this is a distinction that has not been made in the past, and this claim would need to be well understood and tested in key markets. From my perspective, whether we call a carbon horizon claim carbon neutral or something else is a secondary issue, but it is actually really important to many of the organizations that we've talked to because people understand the general concept of carbon neutral. So this is an area we're interested in testing further. The implications are that the carbon horizon model would encourage a broader range of activity and cooperation with shared gains. It could be more easily integrated with other frameworks because of the flexibility around the carbon contribution option. So we're looking at emerging frameworks around risk management, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, biodiversity crediting, and impact investment. It's possible a carbon contribution claim can be more easily integrated there. And then this would be scalable throughout the net zero transition. In Carbon Frontier, if the New Zealand government does not agree to provide corresponding adjustments under its NDC, then this would be limited to offshore mitigation. And this track would be most suited to participants that are very active in export markets or in CORSIA, which is the International Emissions Trading System, which require Paris-compliant corresponding adjustments. If we think conceptually about where the mitigation activities would fall, I've tried to illustrate a series of what I'm calling here additionality zones. So the top blue line represents our projected gross emissions under existing measures, and this is not precisely drawn to scale, it's conceptual. The two black flat lines are our domestic emissions budgets, showing a stepwise progression going downward once the government decides on what those are. And then the red line represents our NDC. So between the blue line and the black line represents the zone of government commitment. The government is saying we will guarantee that policies are going to deliver up to the level of our emissions budgets, but that leaves the gap in blue to meet the NDC. So conceptually, Carbon Horizon would be trying to channel more investment and action to help bridge that gap domestically and reduce the amount of offshore purchasing that's needed to meet the NDC. The Carbon Frontier Zone appears beyond the NDC in red, and this would consist of mitigation for which the government has granted a corresponding adjustment or mitigation that falls outside the scope of the NDC, like small-scale planting or blue carbon. Now, these are not rigid zones, they're conceptual, and I suspect we would end up in a place where these decisions are made by convention about which types of activities could count toward Carbon Horizon versus Carbon Frontier. The additionality assessment process would need more work. At a fundamental level, it would probably include 4 components: looking for regulatory additionality. Does the activity go beyond minimum government requirements? Is there investment additionality? Would the investment go beyond the ETS price incentive? Does the project overcome non-price barriers to implementation? So this is some of what Jeremy was referring to in his introductory comments. It's possible that there are investments that would be viable under an ETS price, but are not happening due to other non-price barriers. And it's possible that voluntary activity could help to unlock some of that, which would be really valuable to help to reduce our need for offshore purchasing. And then we'd be looking for some kind of a technological additionality assessment. This is particularly around ensuring that whatever technologies are being credited are actually consistent with net zero in 2050, and we're not locking ourselves into something intermediate that actually ends up standing in the way. In terms of managing waterbed effects, well, the Carbon Horizon option could operate with or without ETS cap adjustments. If there were ETS downward adjustments and emissions budget adjustments, then the track could reduce offshore purchasing requirements to meet the NDC. But even if we don't have adjustments, there's still value here in terms of redistributing costs to meet cap. So an ETS helps to manage the quantity of the reduction. It doesn't necessarily address the quality. And so there could still be legitimate benefits from voluntary activity within the ETS cap, even if they don't generate a global benefit beyond New Zealand's existing target. For Carbon Frontier, this would require a corresponding adjustment to avoid double counting under the NDC. This track would not reduce offshore purchasing requirements to meet the NDC. So if the government were to grant corresponding adjustments, it would make the NDC harder and more expensive to meet, and the government would still have to purchase offshore mitigation to help bridge the target gap. In terms of reporting, we're suggesting moving beyond just net emissions reporting to a broader approach that would make it easier to track organizations' progress with their own emissions and then how they're contributing to external voluntary mitigation. This is an example of a reporting dashboard that was developed by the Net Zero Initiative. And this is not the only approach to doing this, but it could be a really useful starting place. And here you can see that there are 3 pillars: reducing own emissions, reducing others' emissions, and working with removals. And they distinguish between what happens within the value chain versus outside of the value chain. What's nice about this framework is it's very flexible, and if there's double counting across scope 1, 2, and 3, it's very transparently laid out whose scope 1 emissions in one place becomes someone else's scope 3 emissions somewhere else. And this distinguishes clearly between emissions reductions and removals. And over time, there may be interest in making that distinction more important as organizations are trying to claim carbon neutrality. It would also be possible to integrate more co-benefits into this type of approach. So in terms of some practical examples for how this could work, there's a few in the paper, and I'm just providing shortened examples here. So a firm is evaluating boiler options. A biomass boiler would cost $2 million more than the fossil fuel alternative. If the voluntary carbon market could mobilize carbon finance of $1 million, the project could reduce emissions by 90,000 tons of CO2 during the asset lifetime. This would correspond to an incremental carbon cost of $11 per ton under the VCM. Now, note these numbers are illustrative only, but the idea here is to demonstrate that sometimes when people think about offsetting, they feel like they're paying the ETS price twice. And it's not. It's about finding these opportunities where incremental carbon finance can help get valuable investments over the line. The second option would be around energy efficiency. A local government invites businesses to help capitalize a revolving loan fund for energy efficiency improvements in low-income households. Supporting businesses can claim a pro rata share of the emission reduction generated by the project portfolio over time. The project overcomes both price and non-price barriers to accelerate energy efficiency gains, improve health outcomes, and reduce household power bills. And then I've got two examples in the land sector. The first is native afforestation. A landowner would like to establish a permanent native forest on marginal land, but cannot make the business case work. If the landowner can mobilize additional impact investment reflecting the combined value of carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and other ecosystem services and cultural amenity, then the business case will become viable. And the final example is small-scale forestry. An NGO seeks to plant native trees at scales below the eligibility threshold for crediting under the ETS or under the NDC. Organizations helping to finance the planting receive certification of their contribution, which they can report to board members, shareholders, and consumers. Now, of these four examples, this is the only one that automatically falls outside the scope of an NDC, so this could potentially qualify for Carbon Frontier. The other ones would be more likely to be Carbon Horizon activities unless the government chose to provide a corresponding adjustment. So what would it take to actually make this happen? Well, there's a number of building blocks for successful implementation. This is a list that was brainstormed by some of the participants in our dialogue process. I think fundamentally this would take collaboration and resourcing by both the public and private sectors. One of the key messages that we've been getting during our early engagement is that this process has to be suitably simple for people to participate. If it's too complicated to make an additionality assessment, if it's too risky to make a marketable claim, then organizations are not going to feel comfortable participating. So it needs to be practical to implement, and it needs to have very clear integrity for making marketable claims. We also have some really important needs for further research. So we do need to look more at the conditions that would make a two-track approach acceptable to organizations, investors, consumers, and other stakeholders in both domestic and international markets. Now, this is another concern that's been raised during our early engagement. For organizations that are already participating in carbon neutral offsetting where double counting is not allowed, they feel nervous stepping into new waters unless they're given assurances that it will be accepted in their markets and by their board members who signed off on the original target. We'd want to look at how to align this new track approach with existing environmental, social, and governance reporting frameworks and new requirements for climate-related financial disclosures. And then finally, we want to look at the implications for New Zealand's trade relationships and credibility in the international negotiations under the Paris Agreement. So at the international level, the New Zealand government has signaled very clearly that if it's going to use offshore mitigation to help meet our NDC, that offshore mitigation must carry a corresponding adjustment so it is not double counted by any other government. And then we need to think about are the implications there of then facilitating the double counting of voluntary mitigation under Carbon Horizon. Now, again, in the context of a suitably ambitious NDC and economy-wide ETS and emissions budget, I think there is a legitimate case for doing this, but we need to be able to explain that internationally. And this does create some policy challenges for government. I think a lot of the leadership on this could actually be done in the private sector, but there are a few areas where government involvement would really either be essential or helpful. An essential decision is the government going to provide corresponding adjustments under its Paris target for voluntary domestic action? If the answer is no, then anyone who has to have a corresponding adjustment will have to look offshore. But if the answer is yes, that has target fiscal and equity implications. Again, keep in mind, if the government was to grant a corresponding adjustment, it makes its current NDC harder and more expensive to meet. And this has equity implications for the taxpayers who are going to have to help to bridge the gap. A second area for help would be enabling access to Paris-compatible offshore mitigation for organizations. If there are organizations that do insist on using corresponding adjustments, currently there's no way for them to directly access that kind of offshore mitigation. It's possible the New Zealand government could stand in the market and buy surplus offshore mitigation with corresponding adjustments, which it could then on-sell to domestic organizations wanting to make carbon neutral claims by canceling it. It would be helpful if the government considered whether it would be willing to adjust the ETS cap and emissions budgets downward in response to voluntary mitigation. Again, this is not essential, but it would be helpful. There are still distributional benefits to having voluntary mitigation within the ETS, even if there isn't an immediate cap adjustment. And over time, if the system is adapting more quickly to a successful low emission economy, then it would be possible for the government to increase cap ambition anyway. The government could think about providing facilitative guidance on integrity and marketing claims. This is something that some organizations have said would really be helpful. They would really like the New Zealand government stamp of approval that says, yes, this is a legitimate contribution to our low emission transition, and it's fine for people to make these as marketing claims. Australia has taken that role of creating a government endorsed voluntary mitigation program. In the past, the New Zealand government has not done that. It's taken more of a buyer beware approach, helping to educate people about their options, but not really facilitating those options. The final is managing the implications for the carbon neutral government program. So again, this was launched in December 2020. The government has committed that it wants its public departments to have reduced their emissions and then offset residual emissions starting in 2025. And we are still waiting for policy clarity from government about whether it's expecting that offsetting residual emissions to count toward the NDC or to have to be additional to the NDC, and then also not clear on how that might affect decisions on ETS caps and emissions budgets. So I think there are a number of organizations who will be looking to the government's decisions on carbon neutrality in its own operations and to think about the implications for how that might flow through to them and what kind of a precedent that sets. And we consider that this framework would be flexible enough to accommodate the government's carbon neutral government program. So just to wrap up here, we consider that Aotearoa has a significant opportunity to boost voluntary mitigation. This is such an important opportunity. There are a lot of organizations that are motivated to help. They just want to help, and they want to be able to make a marketable claim to do that. But we have just lost our enabling framework, and we need an effective enabling framework for this to happen. If we were to require corresponding adjustments under the Paris target for all offsetting claims, this really would limit the potential for domestic carbon cooperation. Recognizing voluntary domestic mitigation that helps meet the Paris target could mobilize investment and action and help to shift social norms. Whether we label this alternative as a carbon neutral claim or some other form of carbon contribution is a secondary question, but it really matters to some participants. And we can consider incentivizing a broader range of voluntary actions beyond forestry. Again, forestry has an important and valuable role to play, but there's the potential here to expand voluntary action to energy, to transport, to agriculture, and waste. International conventions are rapidly evolving, and Aotearoa could help to shape them. There actually is a really important leadership opportunity here, but there's also a leadership responsibility, because when offshore organizations are thinking about offsetting, they aren't thinking about it in the context of an advanced industrialized country with an economy-wide emissions trading scheme and economy-wide emissions budgets. Our series of waterbed interactions and so on is complex, and it doesn't fit into the standard international thinking. So we need to help broaden that thinking, and this actually could become a fundamental trade competitiveness issue for New Zealand if the international conventions don't align well with our opportunities to contribute. And finally, the solutions to these challenges will require cooperation and experimentation across the public, private, and civil society sectors. So how far-flung is this proposal? Well, I mean, this issue has been around for a long time. It's not a new problem. And this range of solutions actually has been under discussion for a while internationally as well. And we're seeing this emerging in how organizations are making voluntary claims. And I'll just provide three high-profile international examples. So one is Microsoft, which has taken on a pledge to be carbon negative by 2030. And this is a very complex package. So first of all, they're actually looking at offsetting their historical carbon emissions by 2050. And in addition to reducing their own supply chain emissions through offsetting involving both avoided emissions and carbon removals, they're also investing $1 billion in a climate innovation fund. So here we're seeing a package approach of financing and offsetting and a clear distinction between avoided emissions and removals and between own reductions in supply chain. Here's Walmart. They've taken on a target of 0 emissions across global operations by 2040. And note here, they're specific without carbon offsets. So they are specifically not offsetting as a headline decision. But then alongside that, they have a sort of nature-based solutions commitment to protect, manage, or restore 50 million acres of land and 1 million miles of ocean. So this is not one-for-one offsetting, it's thinking broadly about how are they contributing to climate change action and to nature-based solutions. And then here's Google, which has pledged carbon-free by 2030. They're claiming carbon-free energy by 2030. They're claiming to have neutralized all emissions since 1998 with offsets. And then they've got a series of really big number investments in sustainability, climate change, reforestation. And then this 10 million euro climate impact challenge investment to accelerate EU green recovery. So if you look at all of these examples, again, this is not conventional offsetting, but what we're seeing is organizations contributing to substantial voluntary effort as a way of showing responsibility and maintaining social license. So we'd look forward to engaging with you on this topic, and we're going to do a follow-up webinar on this topic, in engaging an expert panel of people who are actively working in this space in New Zealand. That's scheduled for the 16th of April in the same time slot, 12:30 to 2. There's a full package of the paper and a shorter overview, a Q&A document, and a media release on our website. We'll be making a recording of this available, and I'll be making the PDF of the slides available. And then you can keep in touch on email, check out our blog, and follow us on Twitter. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And I will close down the slide and open up for some Q&A.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to all the panel. Would you like to begin some Q&A now, or Jeremy or Kate, did you want to add something after Catherine's presentation?
No, it's okay. I think we can take questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much again, Catherine, for your fulsome presentation. It's quite a lot there to take in, obviously. Yes. So I'm just going to kick off with the only question we have in at the moment, and I'm not sure who would be best to answer this, but the question is as follows. Are the emissions being double counted as well? For example, if a car rental company funds forest planting to make a carbon neutral claim, and the mitigation is double counted as contributing to New Zealand's mitigations, is New Zealand also counting the emissions the car rental company generates as part of our national emissions?
Yeah, so thanks very much for the question. Yeah, so our national greenhouse gas inventory does record the emissions from every organization for all of their domestic activity here in New Zealand. So you're correct that the emissions would be recorded in our inventory. In this case, the forestry, if it was a domestic forest, would also show up in our inventory. And in the past, if the car rental company was using the Permanent Forest Sink Initiative to do that offsetting, those offsets would be carved out of our target using the unit cancellation process, but everything would still show up in the inventory. And these decisions have evolved by convention over time about what gets counted in our inventory and when people are concerned about double counting and when they're not. And one of the interesting angles on that question is if we now look at that same question into the context of an ETS cap that is binding, then if a car rental company is generating emissions within New Zealand, it's paying the emissions price and it's driving up the emissions price for other actors in the system. If it's trying to offset outside of the ETS, then the benefits of the forest are helping the climate, but they're not helping to compensate for the additional price burden on other participants within the ETS system itself. So this is where the social license issue starts to come into play. And under a stringent target and a binding ETS cap, would it be better for the car rental company to be compensating for its emissions within the ETS system rather than imposing them on the rest of the participants through a higher carbon price? So it adds a further level of complexity to that. Sorry, you're muted, Ruth.
Excuse me, somebody seems to be having an issue using the Q&A function, but we actually do have something coming through here at the chat. So let's just go with that. The question is, hi, oopsie, my apologies. What do you think of the time frame? What do you think the time frame will be before policy clarity is arrived at, and therefore businesses can start making voluntary carbon neutral claims with confidence if they can?
I'm happy to make an initial stab at that, and then if Ika has any further information to provide, that would be great. I think overall this is going to be an area where policy clarity evolves over time, but there's going to be a series of step changes. And the near-term priority from my perspective for policy clarity would be a decision from the government around whether or not it's going to provide corresponding adjustments for domestic action. And then beyond that, we need to start thinking about what an alternative crediting pathway might be that helps to bridge our target gap. And that one might take some more time to develop, and we'll need to be keeping an eye on how the international norms are evolving at the same time as the domestic norms. So I think there'll be probably multiple stages of policy clarity, the first one being about whether there's a domestic corresponding adjustment. And that's the one that may be of greatest concern to the organizations that already have carbon neutral commitments and that want to know how they'll be able to continue meeting those commitments in the future. Will it have to be through offshore mitigation using corresponding adjustments? Can they do that through domestic mitigation using corresponding adjustments? Can they do that through domestic mitigation that falls outside the scope of our NDC? And then when they've got clarity on that, then I think over time, the carbon horizon track will start to evolve. So I don't have more specific information on government timeframes for further decisions on that, but obviously the carbon neutral government program has to start delivering by 2025, and that's not that far away, so they'd be under pressure for decisions there as well. Is there any clarity from Ika about timeframes?
So we can't really comment on policy that are developed now. The thing that everyone knows is that Glasgow conference is in November, and so if a company wants to claim carbon neutrality for this year, there won't be any international consensus before then, I think, because Article 6 discussions are not over. So this is why we wanted to work with Motu to try to find pragmatic solution for New Zealand.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, and this time frame issue, I see you've written in a comment saying, years, not months. It's possible some of the initial policy decisions on domestic corresponding adjustments could happen. I don't know if it's months or hopefully less than 1 to 2 years. I think that decision would need a greater level of urgency. In terms of market acceptability of alternative carbon claims, it's an interesting space, that one, because people are doing it already. And it may not be necessary to have a fully integrated framework in place, but I think it creates more uncertainty and risk for participants if it's not part of an integrated framework. So, I've just shown those 3 high-level corporate examples internationally. There's not an integrated framework that has said, oh, what they're doing is okay, and they need to be prepared to defend it. And so it's possible that organizations will just evolve into this space, doing what they can to help, and they don't necessarily have to wait for full clarity on how the mechanism will work. But it does create this uncertainty. And I think what's most important here is, again, we keep our eyes on the benefits of enabling organizations to act, because there's this growing pressure and interest, and people just want to help and want to do more, and they want to be able to do that and just know how to share with other people what they're doing and how to make a marketable claim that has integrity. And they want to know that what they're doing is helpful and that they can report it publicly without being questioned about whether they're greenwashing. So I think any level of guidance that can be provided in this interim period, just so we don't turn people off I think would be really, really useful. We want to harness that momentum and not discourage it.
Great, Catherine. And just feeding into that, one of our listeners has asked, what first steps would you like to see New Zealand businesses take in the interim?
Thank you. Well, we've already seen some considerable leadership by New Zealand businesses in this space. We've seen the voluntary targets for organizations' own emissions, which are emerging through the Climate Leaders Coalition participants and other leading New Zealand organizations. And we've seen some of the leading offset providers in New Zealand really engaging on this issue and sometimes engaging internationally in the processes that are helping to shape those norms so that people have a better understanding of our context and so that we're keeping really well informed of how the issues are evolving in real time. And I think they're really trying to serve their customer base with the people who want to, the organizations that really want to make a difference. So I think it's helpful that we already have a voluntary carbon market momentum here that we can build on. There's some fundamental building blocks that are there. And I think it would be helpful if businesses help to inform government about what would best unlock some of this opportunity, and then businesses to work among themselves in helping to shape these norms and give each other comfort about the types of marketable claims that they'll be making. I think there's also an opportunity here for us to experiment, to try to do some pilot opportunities, and that might be something that could involve ICA and businesses, for example, or businesses working among themselves to think about how could we do this better than we've done it in the past, and where might a carbon contribution track open up new opportunities. So I think there's a lot that organizations could do to try to start to lead on some of this. Any further comments from ICA on that? You may have a further perspectives.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment on that because it will be hard, of course, to do a claim about carbon neutrality as it is conventionally accepted today. But carbon neutral claim is a brand, and many organizations are changing their brand from time to time for good reason. As I touched base at the beginning, the current offsetting has scalability issues. We are aware of that, and we know we could improve the system. So this is a perfect opportunity to carve out some new form of claim. And the main point is that it is a voluntary carbon market. So it's more about who do you need to convince, who do you need to build the trust with, your customer, your shareholders, and what kind of claim are they keen to see from you. And that's not necessarily carbon neutral, because Catherine showed the example of Google. It's carbon free. That's something that's their claim. You've seen the claim for Walmart. So I think businesses shouldn't be afraid to make a claim that talks to their audience, as long as, of course, there is environmental integrity. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. I do have another question here from one of our attendees. Could you comment on how the disincentive for organisations to purchase voluntary carbon offsets from offshore sources will change as a result of this?
That's a really good question. It'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time. As I mentioned, in the past, it's been relatively easy for New Zealand organizations to source offshore mitigation that could be cancelled and not count toward government targets. Now, there was a spectrum of quality options, and so some of the crediting entities like Gold Standard created screens for identifying the highest quality offsets from offshore sources. So some offshore mitigation has been a very high quality and others has not. And of course, the stuff that has not has tended to tarnish the reputation of all offsetting. So it's important that we not dismiss all of it. I think the challenge here is that we're working under this new world of Paris NDCs. And so far, I'm only aware of one trade, well, two trades between Switzerland and Peru and Ghana that have involved government-to-government transfers with Paris-compliant corresponding adjustments. So we're at the beginning of a very challenging process, and the offsets that are being sold internationally under the Paris framework will have to be additional to countries' targets In the past, the units that came from developing countries just had to be additional to business as usual. Now they have to be additional to a government target. So I think the era of low cost, easily available offshore mitigation has probably ended. And we may not get clarity about exactly what that future supply looks like, till later in the decade. So countries that are selling offshore mitigation will have to be feeling confident that they're going to fully meet their NDC and have some surplus to sell. Now, Motu is doing some separate work on how that could be facilitated through a climate teams model. But again, this is an area where important work is needed. So I think we are in a new place. I think beyond, so one chief consideration here is quality. So it will be critical for that voluntary carbon offsets internationally to have clarity about whether or not they carry a corresponding adjustment and how ambitious the underlying NDC is. Because if a country has a really weak NDC, then it could easily sell lots of offshore mitigation with corresponding adjustments, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has a comparable level of quality to the climate. So there's a further value judgment there. Beyond that, there's the political judgment about what it means to send substantial mitigation offshore when we could be investing it domestically instead. And it is a legitimate contribution to the climate, and it's really, our global future depends on developing countries making this transition just like us. So if organizations feel that they're making a legitimate contribution to climate progress by supporting developing countries and doing that, that's wonderful. But we are sending substantial investment offshore, and maybe we need to be thinking about, well, are there opportunities to use that at home as well? So those are the types of considerations I think will start to influence how organizations craft their future offset portfolio.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to pick that up at all? Jeremy, would you?
Yeah, maybe just to comment from an ICA perspective. Buying offshore, there is a price and the quality of the offsets. So of course, the cheap offsets don't have the same quality than buying offshore on the EU, for example. At ICA, we know that in New Zealand domestically, there is opportunity that are cost effective and that are more cost effective than buying credit offshore, quality credit offshore, and that even more cost effective than forestry in New Zealand. And they are not picked up today. So that could be an incentive to fund this kind of domestic mitigation rather than buying offshore if it is open.
Thanks for that. And here's another question I have that's just come in. So for smaller horizon projects, there would appear to be a potentially substantial admin and verification burden. Establishing a project, verifying mitigations, cancelling credits, etc. Does this suggest a likely size threshold for potential projects?
Thanks, that's a really good question. One of the benefits of having a broad-based emissions trading scheme is that it's supposed to create the price incentive for a lot of things to happen anyway without having to do project-based accounting. You don't have to deal with project additionality and baselines and leakage and all of that if it's all captured within an ETS. So in this carbon horizon track, we'd be looking at a new way of thinking about voluntary offsetting in the context of an ETS, which is more facilitative. What's nice about this option is that the overarching operation of the emissions trading scheme and the emissions budgets does safeguard the environmental impact of the decisions. So in the past, an additionality assessment was about safeguarding the climate. Now the additionality assessment is about, are you really making a legitimate contribution to helping? So it is a slightly different question. One of the things we discussed in our dialogue process is how to minimize those transaction costs around voluntary domestic activities. And an easier way to do this would be, for example, if the government could issue very clear guidance on what its requirement policy pathway looks like, or if it could offer a performance standard and projects that exceed that performance standard would qualify as additional. There may be things that we could do that would make it possible to do larger numbers of replicable projects that meet uniform criteria. And that's the sort of thing that could be developed through convention, with government support and make this a lot easier for everybody. In the past, this process of project by project registration and baseline assessment and so on has been really, really challenging from a technical standpoint and has raised the transaction costs. So we do want to think about how we could do this better. Also, if we're moving into the new world of carbon financing claims or carbon contribution claims, how different might that be? Some of the carbon financing claim models suggest that you take your residual emissions and you multiply it by some emission price, whether that's an ETS price or a social cost of carbon or your company's shadow price or something like that. And then you just invest that equivalent finance in a mitigation activity. So then the verification is a bit different. It's looking at, has that finance been used for the purpose for which it was chosen? And it's not necessarily about quantifying every ton and who it belonged to. Yeah, so that's a bit of a waffly answer to the question, but I think there are steps that we would really want to think about how to make this easy for participants to do. So for example, if I take a flight down to the South Island, instead of ticking a box that says, I'm supporting a forestry project, could I tick a box that say, actually, I want to help low-income households with installation, heat pumps, and double glazing. And I would actually feel happier about that contribution because my decision to take that flight is driving up the emission price, and I would like to be helping low-income households to be more resilient to emission price in the future. So that's where this could come into play. And if we could come up with standardized approaches, it could actually allow a substantial project stream to come on board.
Thank you, Catherine. Jeremy, did you want to pick up on that at all? No, you're good. So I've put something out in the chat. We've actually got that's our last question. So I'm wondering, we finished a little bit earlier. Catherine, you may like to.
I think we've got, I have a couple more that have popped up.
Oh.
In both the Q&A and the chat.
You're right. Excuse me. Yeah. My apologies. So they've just popped up now. That's great. So here we are. Are emissions certifiers / auditors in the voluntary carbon market, both domestic and international, operating under a sufficiently robust and consistent framework? Who regulates and audits them? It seems they will play a critical role in a voluntary carbon market, but the complexity of the accounting required could provide a significant opportunity for fraud. Who ensures that VCCs are actually cancelled?
Thanks very much. I mean, I can answer this question at a high level. The voluntary carbon market has evolved bottom up over time and has grown through experience. And one of the key roles of ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offsetting Alliance, which I mentioned earlier as the umbrella organization, is to provide a code of conduct for the participating organizations and help to safeguard the integrity of these transactions. Because you're absolutely correct, if people lose trust in the integrity of voluntary offsetting, then the system isn't going to work. So I think at this point, the organizations that are adhering to that code of conduct have been performing to a high level, and there has been a range of performance in the market in the past, but I think we do have greater convergence around what the quality standards should look like. But we're now evolving into a new framework where the projects in developing countries now have to be evaluated against NDCs, not just against business as usual. So I think there will have to be some changes to the types of accounting that have been done in the past. And the fact that now if mitigation is being traded government to government, it has to carry a corresponding adjustment. That means that now that mitigation will actually have to go through government accounting as well as voluntary carbon accounting when it carries a corresponding adjustment. So yeah, I think this is an area where having government guidance on how to think about integrity and useful initiatives like a code of conduct for certification organizations can be really helpful. And the fact we're not starting from scratch here, that we actually do have a foundation of quality service providers, helps to get something like this off the ground a lot faster. In terms of ensuring that VCCs are actually canceled, ensuring the integrity is one of the key issues that's being looked at by this task force on scaling voluntary mitigation. One of the key requirements for a successful system is that all transactions are managed in registries. And we are in a system right now where there are multiple registries, but there tend to be a relatively small number of registries where a lot of transactions get focused. I think people are trying to think more broadly about how could we come up with a more centralized registry system that makes it easier to make sure that mitigation isn't being double counted across different registries and things like that. So I think that's part of what the task force is looking at. So in the past, through the use of registries with credible systems, it has been possible to verify when voluntary carbon credits have been appropriately created, transferred, and canceled. Yeah. but hopefully it'll need to improve in the longer term, and having some system of unified, uniform, or linked registries could help with that.
Sure.
If I can add on that, 2 points I want to make. There will always be a trust relationship. So when you buy a product, do you trust the brand that you are buying the product? So if you trust the certifier, it's your choice, it's your relationship, and it's up to the certifier to be trustable. So they have this kind of pressure. But to your point, that's why I think bringing some of the projects to invest domestically makes sense, because it's much more easier to check the quality of the project and where are going the emission, are the emission really credible. So I think that's an added value for domestic projects rather than projects in countries where the corruption rate is much higher. And another point is there is a solution to increase and improve the quality and the trust of the transaction. We could use technology such as blockchain, and that's a potential development for this market. And I'm not talking about Bitcoin, I'm talking about sustainable blockchain.
Well, that's obviously a, sorry, Catherine.
Use of blockchain in this space is beyond my expertise.
Yeah. As we sail into the future, there's obviously quite some concern around, actually keeping track of all of this. So I can really understand those questions. I'm just wondering if there's anything else from our audience today, if that's front of mind. There's an opportunity now to ask that question either in the Q&A or in the chat. And otherwise, I might leave it up to you, Catherine, to sort of make some final closing comments.
There is a question here about the example of a company that financed the boiler instead of a fossil fuel boiler. Yeah, so that's one of these issues about having overlapping organizational boundaries, is that the reductions start getting reported all up and down the supply chain. I think the key concept here for a voluntary carbon market is that in the case where one organization is financing mitigation by another, that's the only company in the supply chain that can claim that mitigation as an offset. So multiple organizations can report the emissions and the emissions reductions, but only one of them takes credit for having financed the offset. Now, when we end up in a future world where every organization has its own target, then if both the greenhouse and the company had their own targets, we'd probably start to look at making corresponding adjustments from the organization that sells the offset to the financer. So it starts to create a further level of complexity. And this is one of those upscaling problems we haven't had to deal with in the past, because we just thought about a small number of organizations that had targets, and then they were doing voluntary offsetting among the wider world that didn't. And if we're now looking at an area, and this could be relevant to the carbon neutral government program, where both departments have a target, if one of them sells an offset to another, then there should be a corresponding adjustment. So it starts to open up a more complex world of target accounting that makes one's head spin.
And I have a question back to this question is it important and does it matter? Because that's why we put in our proposals accounting system that is much transparent. Because in your example, the two companies will report the emission savings, but they will report it in different categories, one in scope 1 and one in scope 3. And so in that case, it's transparent. It just says the claim is we have collaborated on this project, and one company will claim reducing its own emission, and the other company will claim having reduced the emission of another company. And it brings us in a world of collaboration between companies rather than just competition for the claim. And the best outcome is that the project is happening. And for us, that's the key thing we should keep in mind for this kind of thinking.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I'm seeing another question that has come through on organizations that have recently made carbon neutral claims and commitments. What does this mean for them over the next 1 to 4 years? What can they do to ensure the claims are still valid? Can they buy and cancel credits produced in 2019 and continue to use them to claim neutrality? I really would like to see a system evolves that maintains continuity to these commitments. The commitments came from a really good place, and they've involved a lot of corporate commitment and investment already. And I think we owe it to these organizations to provide a framework that enables them to uphold their commitment, and to make the kind of carbon contribution that they are hoping to make. We're already falling into this transition zone from one regime to another. And there is, there are leftover PFSI and ZUs that are currently available this year and being used for offsetting claims. I don't personally know exactly what will happen after 2021. It's if those units were legitimately claimed in the past and not counted toward targets, from a theoretical standpoint, banking them and using some of them in the future might be reasonable. But this, that's not a permanent solution to the challenge that we're facing. And yeah, it's also worth noting that the government is moving from the Kyoto regime into the Paris regime with a large surplus, which it's planning to cancel anyway. So there might be questions about the longer term use of some of those units. But I think for a transition period, it's important that organizations have the means to uphold their commitments and that we provide this kind of clarity so that people know how to manage it. I would recommend that people get advice from some of the leading New Zealand organizations that offer these services, because they may have more expert views than I do about how ongoing use of stockpiled offsets might be viewed in the market. I think it's just another reason why we need to get clarity on this issue as soon as possible. Okay.
Well, I think that really might be at this time, Catherine. So I'm wondering if you'd just like to wrap up with a few sort of closing comments, and we'll leave it for today.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thank you very much to all of you who participated in this webinar. And I just want to extend a special thanks to the people who have engaged with us in developing this work. Your views have been really appreciated. We've canvassed a range of views, and we know that there's not wide agreement, about exactly what this future should look like, but we're all agreed there's an issue here that needs to be addressed. And I also just want to acknowledge ICA's leadership in commissioning this work and the dialogue process so that we can have a conversation that's overdue in New Zealand and try to start figuring out what the solution space might look like. What this document is offering is a very high-level framework. As you've revealed with your excellent questions today, this needs further development to move ahead. But I do see enormous potential in both creating a viable option for people who want to stay in the conventional offsetting track where nothing gets counted, and for those who just want to do good things to help, who have more of a Team New Zealand approach and just want to help Aotearoa to meet our target. And if we can figure out how to make that work in a practical, manageable way, I think we could achieve really exciting outcomes. So it'll be interesting to stay engaged in this space and further develop the work. This is not the solution to everything. It's the beginning of a longer term conversation.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Your enthusiasm is completely contagious. Thank you once again to yourself and the ICA team for your thought leadership in this really important space where we're sitting now. And I just wanted everybody to know that we will be sending out a recording, and we'll be hosting that also on the Motu website. And so thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And with that, I'm going to push the end button and finish this webinar. Thanks to you all.
Thank you.